The first time I met Captain David Harris, he was trying to convince airport security that Jesus Christ himself had personally cleared his Boeing 757 for takeoff. The very notion, so audacious, so profoundly out of place within the meticulous, secular choreography of airport operations, struck me with an almost physical force. It shattered the quiet hum of my small office adjacent to the airport chapel, a sanctuary I usually filled with the soft murmur of prayer, the gentle turning of worn missals, and the comforting scent of old paper and beeswax. This was my refuge, a small island of the sacred amidst the ceaseless tide of the profane, the frantic, the utterly practical. The call came through, cutting sharply across the stillness. It was Officer Miller, young, earnest, his voice tinny with a barely controlled panic that sliced through the usual terminal static, that distant, anonymous drone of announcements and rolling luggage. My heart gave a sudden, unwelcome lurch, a cold prickle of premonition tracing a path down my spine. "Father Michael, you need to get to gate C26. Now. It's the strangest thing. The pilot, he's saying things." The urgency in his tone was unmistakable, raw, and desperate. Miller knew me. He knew my work here wasn't just about offering last rites to the dying or weary blessings to travelers. It was about tending to the messy human crises that sometimes erupted in this transient space between earth and sky, a place often holding both the highest hopes and the deepest anxieties. But this call felt different, sharper, more profound. It carried a resonance that hinted at something beyond mere human frailty or stress. I moved, not walked. The urgency in Miller's voice was infectious, a cold dread seeping into my very bones, compelling me with a force that belied my usual contemplative pace. My stole, the purple symbol of my office and the centuries of priestly service it represented, felt heavy around my neck like an anchor, both grounding me in my sacred duty and simultaneously pulling me forward into something utterly unknowable. I offered a swift, silent prayer as I hurried out, a plea for guidance, for wisdom, for strength in the face of whatever bizarre spiritual emergency awaited me. The sterile, brightly lit concourse, usually a river of indifferent faces flowing with a quiet purpose, now pulsed with a nervous energy. A growing knot of confusion, like a thunderhead gathering on a clear horizon, coalesced around gate C26. The air itself seemed to crackle with an unspoken tension, a scent of fear mingling with the familiar aromas of stale coffee and disinfectant. Hushed whispers replaced the usual chatter, and heads turned, eyes wide with questions no one could answer. I arrived to controlled chaos. Not a riot, not a brawl, but a suffocating pressure of disbelief and professional outrage. It was a silent storm, all sharp glares and tightened jaws. Airline executives, their faces tight with corporate terror, barked clipped commands into cell phones, their voices like pistol shots, each word a testament to millions of dollars now hanging precariously in the balance. FAA officials, grim-faced and stoic, their postures rigid with indignation, scribbled furiously on clipboards, already compiling the damning evidence for what they surely viewed as a catastrophic breach of every safety protocol. And at the epicenter, surrounded by a phalanx of bewildered Port Authority officers, whose expressions ranged from outright confusion to uncomfortable pity, stood Captain David Harris. He was a decorated pilot, a man whose picture, I vaguely recalled, hung in the airline's Hall of Fame. A steady hand with thousands of flight hours, a paragon of competence, but the man before me was a ghost of that image. His face was pale, slick with sweat that beaded at his temples despite the crisp, almost chilly air conditioning of the terminal. His uniform, usually impeccable, seemed to hang on him, slightly askew, as if he had dressed in haste or forgotten how to wear it properly. A stray thread dangled from his sleeve, a small disarray in a man whose life was built on meticulous order. His eyes, though, were what truly seized me. What stopped me in my tracks and silenced the flurry of internal questions. Wide, bloodshot from lack of sleep, or perhaps from the intensity of his experience, yet burning with an unnerving calm, a terrifying conviction that froze the blood in my veins. This was not the frantic, darting gaze of a madman. It was something far more disturbing, the unsettling, quiet power of a true believer who has faced the undeniable. He was talking, relentlessly, not shouting, not raving, but explaining, patiently, logically, as if detailing a pre-flight checklist to a bewildered co-pilot. His voice, though strained, was even, devoid of the emotional frenzy one might expect. And so, the voice was clear, absolute. It said, "David, my son, take them up. It is time to go now." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, a loving command. His words hung in the air, grotesque and impossible, a blasphemy to the very laws of physics and protocol that govern this place, this gleaming temple of modern transportation. Every rational bone in my body screamed for me to dismiss it, to categorize it as delusion, a tragic breakdown. Yet something in his unwavering gaze, the sheer, undeniable sincerity of his tone, prevented me from doing so. The theological implications sent a shiver through me. My son. How many times had I heard those words echoed in scripture, in sacred texts? To hear them now, from a pilot, here, in a sterile airport concourse, was to have the veil between worlds thinned to transparency. The magnificent silver beast of the Boeing 757, Flight 918 to Rome, sat behind him, tethered to the jet bridge, its powerful engines silent, unmoving. But it had moved. Minutes earlier, Harris had initiated the pushback sequence, overriding a bewildered ground crew whose confusion had rapidly escalated to open rebellion, and a furious air traffic control tower whose frantic radio calls he had simply ignored. He had done it without clearance, without reason, on nothing more than this voice. The audacity, the sheer career-ending defiance of his actions, was staggering. The airline executives saw a man having a catastrophic mental breakdown, their multi-million-dollar asset now a symbol of monumental liability, a stain on their corporate reputation. The FAA saw a career-ending breach of protocol, a safety violation that would haunt their regulatory annals for decades, threatening the very credibility of air travel itself. The 300 bewildered passengers, now deplaned and fuming in the concourse, saw only an inexplicable, infuriating delay. Their itineraries were ruined, their tempers frayed, their vacation plans unraveling. They didn't see a miracle. They saw an incompetent, perhaps insane pilot. Their grumbling was a low, insistent hum beneath the tension, a chorus of earthly inconvenience. But I saw something else entirely. I saw a man wrestling with an impossibility so profound it threatened to tear him apart, yet simultaneously held him together with an unwavering grip. He wasn't mad, not in the clinical dismissive way they meant. He was utterly, terrifyingly convinced. His certainty wasn't the frantic energy of a lunatic, but the unsettling, quiet power of a true believer who has faced the undeniable, a revelation that has scorched away all doubt. He wasn't inventing a story for personal gain or malice. He was recounting a truth that defied every single rational explanation, a truth that had just driven him to jeopardize his entire life, his entire career, for something no one else could comprehend. The cost of his conviction was evident in every line etched on his pale face. He looked at me then, his eyes locking onto my stole, onto the small, simple cross around my neck, the silent symbols of my priesthood. In their depths, I saw not madness, but the raw, desperate, flickering light of a faith I thought had long been extinguished. Not just in him, but perhaps a faith that had flickered in the very heart of this sterile, modern world, a world so quick to dismiss anything beyond its own tangible grasp. This was not a man losing his mind. This was a man utterly convinced by something no one else could hear, a solitary witness to a divine command. He had pushed an aircraft from its gate, alone, on an impulse from the divine, and in that terrifying, impossible conviction lay a truth that was about to consume us all. The ground beneath us, the very foundation of what we thought we knew, was about to crack open, revealing something far greater than any of us could yet imagine. As the initial storm of panic subsided, its frantic winds still whipping through the distant corridors of the terminal, but hushed in our immediate vicinity, I was allowed to sit with David in a quiet conference room. The fluorescent lights hummed a steady, unforgiving note overhead, stripping the room of any warmth or intimacy. David sat across from me at a long, polished table, his earlier agitation replaced by a profound, almost bone-deep weariness. He was no longer trying to convince anyone. He simply existed in the aftermath of his own impossible truth. The pale blue of his pilot's uniform seemed to absorb the stark light, making him appear even more drained, a canvas on which the invisible strokes of grief and bewilderment were etched. The pastoral rhythm of my life as a chaplain at JFK International had taught me that crises here, amidst the roar of engines and the ceaseless ebb and flow of humanity, are rarely about the mechanics of flight. They are about the mechanics of the human heart. They are about souls in transit, often lost, often found, sometimes shattering, sometimes mending. I had seen everything from the quiet despair of a missed connection to the raw agony of a loved one's final journey, a journey that began not in the air but in the depths of a soul. And in each instance, my role was not to judge, not to fix, but simply to be present, a vessel for empathy, a listening ear in the cacophony of modern life. David's hands, which only hours before had been expertly guiding a massive metal bird through the intricate dance of pre-flight checks, now rested limply on the table, knuckles white, fingers slightly trembling. His eyes, the startling blue of a clear winter sky, were bloodshot, rimmed with a sorrow that went far beyond the immediate professional fallout. This was not the fear of a man whose career was on the line, though that fear was undoubtedly there, a cold knot in his stomach. No, this was the look of a man who had glimpsed something sacred, something terrifying, and was now grappling with its uncontainable reality, alone. "Father Michael," he began, his voice a gravelly whisper, a stark contrast to the confident, authoritative tones I imagined he used in the cockpit. He paused, collecting himself, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. "David, it's why I'm here. To listen, to understand. Take your time." I spoke softly, letting the silence hang heavy, inviting him to fill it on his own terms. I wanted him to feel safe, to know that this space was different from the sterile interrogation he had just endured. That here, the language of the soul superseded the language of regulations. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if searching the featureless sky for an answer. "They think I've lost my mind, Father. Perhaps I have." He shook his head, a wry, humorless twist to his lips. "Funny thing is, I thought I'd lost it a long time ago. Or rather, I thought I'd lost the reason to keep it." And so, slowly, haltingly at first, then with a growing desperate need to articulate the unspeakable, David Harris began to tell me his story. It was a story not of a sudden break from reality, but of a gradual, agonizing unraveling, a testament to the profound and enduring wound that grief can inflict upon the human spirit. He was, he explained, a good man, or at least he had striven to be. A lifelong Catholic, raised in the solid, unwavering traditions of the Church, his faith had always been a quiet, constant presence, like the deep hum of a well-maintained engine. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was fundamental, the unspoken framework of his moral compass, the gentle rhythm of his family life. He had met Maria in college, at a Newman Center retreat, drawn to her luminous smile and the quiet, fierce devotion that emanated from her very being. She was, he said, the anchor of his soul, the vibrant heart of his home, and the living embodiment of the faith they shared. "Maria," he whispered, the name itself a prayer, a sigh of longing. "She was everything. Truly, my compass, my North Star." A faint, almost ghost-like smile touched his lips, a fleeting echo of a joy now distant. "She had this way, Father, of seeing the sacred in the mundane. A sunrise, a shared meal, even the way the light fell through the kitchen window in the mornings. She'd always say, 'David, look, God's little love note for us today.' And I'd see it, too, through her eyes. Their life together, he painted for me, was not without its trials, but it was rich, textured, woven with threads of shared laughter, quiet prayers, and an abiding love. They had no children, a quiet sorrow they had carried together, but their love for each other had filled that space, overflowing into their community, their church. Maria volunteered at the local soup kitchen, taught catechism to rambunctious 7-year-olds, and her rosary beads were never far from her grasp. Her faith wasn't just a belief system, it was a living, breathing entity, a vibrant garden she tended with unwavering devotion, and in which David found deep solace. Then, a year prior, that vibrant garden had been struck by a blight, sudden and merciless. Cancer. It had been swift, brutal, unyielding. Maria, ever the warrior of faith, had faced it with a courage that both humbled and terrified David. She clung to her rosary, found strength in the sacraments, her eyes often fixed on the crucifix in their bedroom, a calm resolve on her face even as her body betrayed her. He had watched, helpless, as the light in her eyes dimmed, as her once vibrant spirit was slowly, agonizingly eroded by the disease. Each day he saw a piece of her, and a piece of himself, slip away. "I prayed, Father," he recounted, his voice catching, thick with unshed tears. "I prayed like I had never prayed before in my life. Bargained, begged, pleaded. I told God, take me, take anything, just not her, not Maria." But it was as if my words just evaporated into the air. No answer, no comfort, just silence, an empty, mocking silence. When Maria finally succumbed, passing peacefully in her sleep, her hand still clasped in his, something vital within David had fractured. It wasn't just the grief of losing his wife. It was the raw, burning resentment that consumed his every waking moment. His faith, once the quiet hum, had gone utterly silent. It hadn't merely weakened, it had, in his words, been extinguished. "It was like this," he explained, gesturing vaguely, searching for the right metaphor. "You know how you live in a house your whole life, and there are certain rooms you just always use? The kitchen, the living room, the bedroom. My faith, Maria's faith, it was like the main living space in our home. And then she was gone. And suddenly that room, it felt empty, cold, full of ghosts. So I locked it. And then I started bricking it over, one brick at a time, until it was just a solid wall, a sealed-off part of me. I couldn't bear to even look at the doorway." He had stopped praying, not with a dramatic renunciation, but with a quiet, stubborn refusal to engage with a God he felt had utterly abandoned him. The rosary beads Maria had given him, which he used to carry in his flight bag, now lay forgotten in a dusty drawer. He hadn't set foot in a church since Maria's funeral. The solemn mass a blur of pain and disbelief. The hymns, the familiar rituals, the very air of sanctity, they had all felt like a cruel mockery, a reminder of what he had lost, a God he no longer trusted. In the year since Maria's death, David had adopted a new rhythm for his life, a cold, technical precision that mirrored the intricate machinery he commanded. He flew. He flew with a meticulous, almost robotic detachment. The cockpit became his sanctuary, not for spiritual contemplation, but for sterile, procedural exactness. Each pre-flight checklist, each calculated trajectory, each precise landing was an act of control, a small defiance against the chaotic, uncontrollable grief that still churned beneath the surface. His spirit, once nourished by faith and love, was now running on empty, sustained only by the mechanical demands of his profession. He was a man hollowed out, a beautifully crafted vessel with a gaping hole where its heart should have been. I listened, my heart heavy as he spoke, the weight of his words painting a vivid portrait of spiritual desolation. He wasn't looking for absolution, not yet. He was simply laying bare the landscape of his soul, a desolate plain scarred by loss. He had thought he was strong, he told me. Strong enough to bear the pain, strong enough to simply carry on, to fly, to exist. He had convinced himself that procedure, precision, and the cold, unfeeling logic of aviation could fill the void Maria had left. He had built his new life on a foundation of professional competence, a towering edifice of control designed to wall off the aching emptiness within. But now, that edifice had been shaken to its core. The voice, the impossible whisper that had commanded him to move his plane, had not spoken to the pilot, the man of procedure. It had spoken to David, the man of grief, the man whose spirit was running on empty, whose faith had been bricked over. It had bypassed the professional facade and reached straight into that sealed-off room, into the very core of his wounded soul. "So, Father," he concluded, his voice barely audible, his eyes searching mine with a raw, desperate vulnerability. "When they ask me why I did it, why I moved the plane against all protocol, against everything I believe in as a pilot, all I can tell them is that I heard a voice, and it felt like the first time I had felt anything real, anything alive, since Maria died." He swallowed hard, his gaze falling to his trembling hands. "It felt like a part of me that I thought was dead, woke up, and that terrifies me more than anything else." I understood. I saw not a man having a catastrophic mental breakdown, but a man wrestling with an impossibility, a man whose carefully constructed wall of grief and detachment had just been utterly demolished by an act of profound, inexplicable grace. And in his terrified eyes I saw not madness, but the desperate, flickering light of a faith I thought had long been extinguished. Not just in him, but perhaps a faith that had flickered in the very heart of this sterile, modern world, a world so quick to dismiss anything beyond its own tangible grasp. This was not a man losing his mind. This was a man utterly convinced by something no one else could hear, a solitary witness to a divine command. He had pushed an aircraft from its gate, alone, on an impulse from the divine. And in that terrifying, impossible conviction lay a truth that was about to consume us all. The ground beneath us, the very foundation of what we thought we knew, was about to crack open, revealing something far greater than any of us could yet imagine. David Harris was not merely recounting an event. He was opening a window into the raw wound of his soul, a wound that only a miracle could heal. He spoke with a chilling clarity that defied any diagnosis of psychosis, a precision forged by a lifetime of meticulous flight plans and checklists, now applied to an event that shredded every known protocol. David Harris was not merely recounting an event, he was opening a window into the raw wound of his soul, a wound that only a miracle could heal. As he began to articulate the impossible, the sterile conference room seemed to fade, replaced by the hushed sanctity of a confessional, where the most extraordinary truths often find their light. I listened, my heart a quiet echo chamber, as he navigated the labyrinth of his experience, guiding me through the moments that transformed an ordinary pre-flight check into an encounter with the divine. "It was just another Thursday, Father," he began, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, eyes fixed on some distant internal horizon. "Routine. Every system green, fuel loaded, passengers boarding. My co-pilot, Mark, was going through the final checks on his side. The cabin was buzzing with the usual anticipation. A few crying babies, the rustle of newspapers, the low murmur of conversations. But up here," he gestured vaguely, as if the cockpit of that Boeing 777 was still wrapped around us. "Up here it was quiet. The steady hum of the avionics, the soft glow of the instrument panel. That's my piece, you know? The order, the predictability." I nodded, understanding. For a man who had lost so much to the chaos of illness and grief, the structured world of flight offered a refuge, a place where rules were absolute and consequences calculable. It was a cold comfort, perhaps, but a comfort nonetheless. I was running through the final items on my pre-flight list, he continued. His hands, calloused from years on the yoke, now lay still on the polished table, as if still searching for the familiar controls. Checking the trim, the flap settings, confirming the ATC clearance for pushback. Everything was by the book, exactly as it should be. And then, he paused, a catch in his throat, his gaze drifting from that internal horizon to meet mine. In his eyes I saw not madness, but the profound bewilderment of a man who had been blindsided by grace. The moment stretched, heavy with the unspoken, with the very impossibility he was about to lay bare. And then, Father, it happened, he said, the words barely audible. A feeling. It wasn't a physical sensation, not exactly. More like a sudden, overwhelming peace. Like the air in the cockpit thickened, became warm. Not hot, but gentle. A living warmth. It settled over me, washing away the low hum of the engines, the distant chatter of the ground crew. Everything else just faded. He closed his eyes for a moment, reliving it. It was familiar, that warmth. So familiar it brought a fresh wave of grief, even in its tenderness. It was Maria. It felt like Maria. Like she was right there, sitting in the jump seat behind me, her hand on my shoulder, just as she used to do sometimes when she'd meet me after a flight, waiting for me to deplane. Her quiet presence, that unshakable peace she always carried. My heart ached for him. To feel the presence of a lost loved one, especially in a moment of such profound solitude, was a common manifestation of grief. But David's recounting had a different resonance, a deeper current. It wasn't a memory, it was an infusion. And then I heard it, he said, opening his eyes, now wide and searching. Not through the headset, not through the cabin speakers, not with my ears, not physically. It was inside me, inside my soul, Father. A voice. He leaned forward, his urgency palpable, as if needing me to truly grasp the intimate internal nature of this communication. It was a man's voice, clearer than any sound I've ever heard, yet so gentle, so infinitely, utterly gentle. But beneath that gentleness, there was authority, absolute authority. Not demanding, not harsh, but an authority that simply was. Like the voice of someone who knew everything, saw everything, and loved unconditionally, despite it all. There was no doubt in me, not a speck of it, that this was the voice of Jesus Christ himself. I felt a shiver trace its way down my spine. The words, uttered with such unwavering conviction, painted a picture far beyond hallucination. This was not a man's mind unraveling. It was a soul encountering the sacred. And what did the voice say, David? I asked. My own voice hushed, almost reverent. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the memory still fresh, still raw with wonder and terror. It said, David, my son, take them up. It is time to go now. The simplicity of the command was startling. No grand pronouncements, no complex instructions, just 3 short, direct sentences, delivered with an intimacy that spoke volumes. David, my son. The personalization, the affirmation of his identity not just as a pilot, but as a beloved child. Take them up. A clear, unambiguous instruction to act. It is time to go now. An urgency that defied the slow, deliberate pace of airport operations. It wasn't a suggestion, Father, he explained, his voice trembling now, the awe mingling with the residual fear of that moment. It was a loving command, a call to action, from a source I instinctively knew I could not disobey. It wasn't a choice. It was an imperative. Like the very fabric of my being recognized it, and responded. I watched him, my priestly discernment stirring. He wasn't trying to convince me of the validity of his experience through argument, but through the sheer weight of his conviction. He was simply stating a truth that had been revealed to him. My first thought was, this is impossible, David confessed, running a hand through his thinning hair. We're not cleared. ATC hasn't given us the pushback. Ground crew isn't ready. We have 5 minutes still before our scheduled departure time. My training, Father, it screamed at me. Every fiber of my professional being rebelled. But then, the voice, it wasn't a distant whisper fading away. It was still there, a resonance within my very bones, a profound certainty. The peace remained, that absolute knowing, and I knew, with every cell in my body, that I had to move that plane. Now. He recounted the next few moments with a meticulous detail that highlighted the immense internal struggle he faced. I looked at Mark, my co-pilot. He was still engrossed in his checklist, oblivious. I didn't say anything to him immediately. How could I? Jesus just told me to move the plane. He'd have me sedated and carted off the tarmac. I initiated the pushback sequence, engaged the parking brake release, signaled the tug operator through the intercom. I went through the motions, Father, but my hands felt alien. My body was acting on an impulse that had nothing to do with my brain, nothing to do with what I'd been trained to do for 30 years. His eyes, still reflecting the shock of that decision, conveyed the utter loneliness of that moment. To act on such an internal divine command, against all external logic and procedure, must have been terrifyingly isolating. The tug operator came on the intercom, confused. "Captain Harris, you're not cleared for pushback. Stand by, sir." I remember his voice, tinny and incredulous, and then ATC, their voice crackling with irritation. "Flight 918, confirm pushback request. You are not cleared." They were furious, Father, and rightly so. I was breaking every rule in the book. "What did you say to them?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. David shook his head. I didn't have an explanation, not one that made any earthly sense. All I knew was that I had to go. The urgency was absolute. The voice was a loving command, yes, but it was also a command that permitted no hesitation, no debate. I heard myself say, "ATC, Flight 918 initiating pushback. We have an immediate departure requirement." It was a lie, a breach, an act of insubordination that would have ended my career on the spot. But it wasn't a lie in my soul. In my soul, it was the truth. The only truth. He paused again, his gaze distant, lost in the echoing reverberations of that moment. The tug operator argued. ATC argued. Mark, my co-pilot, finally looked up, bewildered, his face a mask of disbelief as he saw the pushback indicators come alive. "David, what are you doing? We're not cleared." Even he thought I'd lost my mind, but I couldn't stop. I simply couldn't. The voice, that inner certainty, was stronger than all of them, stronger than all my training, stronger than my fear of disciplinary action, stronger than the entire logical framework of the modern airport. It was an impulse from the divine, Father, a holy impulse I couldn't begin to explain, but one I absolutely could not, would not, disobey. He looked at me then, his eyes pleading for understanding, not validation. I know it sounds insane. I know it defies everything we understand about the world, about reality, about faith itself. A pilot hearing a voice and moving a plane. It's the stuff of movies, or mental institutions. But I swear to you, Father, on Maria's memory, on everything holy I have left in me, that voice was real, and it came from God. The room was silent, save for the distant, muted roar of aircraft taking off or landing, a counterpoint to the quiet unfolding of this extraordinary narrative. David Harris had laid bare his soul, revealing a desperate act of faith born of an encounter that transcended human understanding. He wasn't looking for absolution from me, but perhaps a witness to the inexplicable, a spiritual counterpart to the divine command he had obeyed. And as I listened to his trembling words, to the raw honesty of his conviction, I felt a deep, profound stirring within my own spirit. The ground beneath us, the very foundation of what we thought we knew, was about to crack open, revealing something far greater than any of us could yet imagine. David Harris was not merely recounting an event, he was opening a window into the raw wound of his soul, a wound that only a miracle could heal. And I, a humble priest in an airport office, was about to become an unwilling yet undeniably privileged witness. The raw wound of David's soul hung exposed in the air between us, a testament to an experience that had ripped through the fabric of his meticulously ordered life. As I sat there witnessing the tremor in his hands, the bewildered yet unwavering conviction in his eyes, I knew a storm was gathering, one far more tempestuous than any mere airport delay could warrant. The ground beneath us, the very foundation of what we thought we knew, was about to crack open, revealing something far greater than any of us could yet imagine. David Harris was not merely recounting an event, he was opening a window into the raw wound of his soul, a wound that only a miracle could heal. And I, a humble priest in an airport office, was about to become an unwilling yet undeniably privileged witness. The immediate aftermath was a maelstrom of confusion and escalating alarm. The young Port Authority officer who had initially called me, a fresh-faced man named Officer Riley, now stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and genuine fear. Word had spread like wildfire through the terminal's intricate veins. An international flight, a Boeing 757 bound for Rome, had begun its pushback sequence without proper clearance from air traffic control. This wasn't a minor infraction. It was an act of insubordination so egregious it bordered on mutiny. The air crackled with a tension that felt more akin to a military alert than a civilian flight delay. "Father Michael," Officer Riley began, his voice barely a whisper, though it cut through the low thrum of the building's unseen machinery. "They've taken Captain Harris to Conference Room B. The airline's lawyers are on their way, and the FAA's already sending a team. This is bad, Father." I nodded slowly. my gaze still fixed on David, who had now risen, a strange calm settling over him, an eerie stillness that spoke of an acceptance of the inevitable. He looked at me, a silent plea in his eyes, a desperate longing for understanding in a world suddenly devoid of it. I gave him a small, reassuring nod, a silent promise to remain. My role as chaplain was not to judge, but to bear witness, to offer solace in the crucible of human suffering and confusion. Sometimes my most important duty was simply to be present, a silent anchor in a turbulent sea. We walked through the bustling concourse, the usual symphony of announcements, rolling luggage, and hurried goodbyes now punctuated by the anxious whispers of deplaned passengers from Flight 918. Their expressions ranged from irritation to outright fury. They had been told there was a technical issue, a euphemism that did little to quell their simmering anger. A delay of this magnitude for an international flight meant missed connections, ruined plans, and the growing specter of extended discomfort. They didn't know the half of it, of course, and for their sake I hoped they never would, at least not in the way David was experiencing it. Conference Room B was a stark, almost clinically sterile space, designed for efficiency, not comfort. The fluorescent lights hummed with an unwavering, unforgiving intensity, casting a harsh, shadowless glare on the polished laminate table that dominated the room. It was a space designed for judgment, for the cold dissection of facts and regulations, utterly devoid of the warmth or nuance that human experience so often demands. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the metallic tang of unspoken accusation. When we entered, a phalanx of stern-faced individuals already occupied various seats. There was Mr. Thorne, the airline's regional operations manager, a man whose face was perpetually etched with the weight of corporate responsibility. Beside him sat Ms. Albright, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman introduced as counsel for the airline, her eyes like chips of glacial ice. And across from David's designated seat, already set with a yellow legal pad and an array of pens, was Mr. Davies, a senior investigator from the Federal Aviation Administration. He was a man of impressive build, with a closely cropped beard and a gaze that seemed capable of stripping away pretense with a single, unblinking stare. Their presence alone was a heavy weight, a collective pronouncement of the gravity of the situation. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was an official inquiry, the opening act in what would undoubtedly be a career-ending drama for Captain David Harris. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This was the earthly judgment, poised to descend with the full force of regulations, protocols, and the unwavering logic of the secular world. I positioned myself quietly in a corner, out of the direct line of fire, yet close enough to observe David, to offer a silent prayer, a quiet presence. My collar was a beacon, a small yet potent symbol of a different kind of authority, one that these individuals in their tailored suits and steely expressions likely held in low regard, if they considered it at all. Mr. Thorne cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to slice through the already taut silence. "Captain Harris," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth, "we need you to recount, in precise detail, the events that led to you initiating pushback sequence for Flight 918, defying air traffic control's explicit hold order." David sat ramrod straight, his hands clasped on the table before him. He was a picture of professional composure, even as the world around him teetered on the brink of collapse. "Mr. Thorne," he responded, his voice steady, though I detected a subtle tremor in the very fabric of his being, a ghost of the man I had spoken with earlier. "I have already provided a statement to ground operations. I heard a voice. It told me to go." A collective sigh, barely audible, swept through the officials. Ms. Albright leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Captain Harris, we appreciate your candor. However, this is a formal inquiry. We need an explanation that aligns with established aviation protocols and procedures. Are you suggesting an unauthorized communication frequency was intercepted? Or perhaps a system malfunction?" David met her gaze, his own eyes holding a depth of conviction that seemed to baffle them. "No, ma'am, it was not a system malfunction. It was not on any frequency. It was within me." Mr. Davies, the FAA investigator, spoke then, his voice a low rumble that conveyed authority without needing to raise in volume. "Captain, you have over 25 years of exemplary service, a flawless record. You understand the absolute criticality of adhering to air traffic control directives. Your decision to disregard a hold order, especially for an international flight, is unprecedented. It created a serious safety hazard. Can you explain the rationale behind such a profound breach of protocol?" David hesitated, his gaze briefly flicking to me, as if seeking an understanding he knew would not be found in this room. "My rationale," he said slowly, choosing his words with immense care, "was the safety of the passengers and crew. I acted out of an instinctive, unshakable conviction that we needed to depart immediately." "Instinctive conviction," Ms. Albright interjected, a slight incredulity tainting her otherwise neutral tone. "Captain, your career is built on a foundation of meticulously learned procedures, rigorous training, and adherence to regulations, not on instinct. Did you experience any unusual physiological symptoms? Lightheadedness? Disorientation? Any issues with your medication, perhaps?" The line of questioning was growing clearer now. They weren't seeking an explanation for a miracle. They were building a case for a medical incident, a psychological break, anything that would allow them to classify this as an unfortunate human error, rather than something far more unsettling. Their pens hovered over their notepads, poised to record the end of a man's career, the clinical dissection of his sanity. "No, ma'am," David replied, his voice firm. "I felt perfectly well, clear of mind. In fact, I felt a peace I haven't known in a long time." He paused, and for a fleeting moment I saw a flicker of that earlier terror, that raw vulnerability, return to his eyes. It was a voice. I know how it sounds, but it was real, and it was absolute. Mr. Davies leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his posture radiating a quiet, dangerous intensity. "Captain, let's be very precise. You claim to have heard a voice inside your soul, a voice that gave you a direct, unequivocal command to initiate takeoff. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," David affirmed. His chin lifted slightly, a thread of defiance woven into his weary resignation. "And you believed this voice to be divine?" Mr. Davies asked, a subtle, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corners of his lips. The word divine hung in the air, foreign and misplaced in this sterile chamber of earthly logic. David didn't flinch. "I believed it was the voice of Jesus Christ." A silence descended then, deeper and colder than before. Mr. Thorne pinched the bridge of his nose, his exasperation palpable. Miss Albright exchanged a meaningful glance with Mr. Davies, a silent acknowledgement that their initial suspicions were proving correct, or at least easily provable. This was not a professional mistake. It was a delusion, a catastrophic breakdown in the critical faculties of a pilot responsible for 300 lives. I felt a pang of profound sadness watching David navigate this treacherous terrain. He was trying to explain the ineffable, the sacred, to minds trained to dissect the profane. He was speaking the language of faith in a room that only understood the dialect of fact and regulation. How could he possibly bridge that chasm? How could he make them understand that the very act they condemned as dangerous and irrational was, in his profound and terrifying conviction, the only path to safety? The questioning continued, a relentless, methodical chipping away at David's credibility. They asked about his personal life, probing into his recent bereavement, the loss of his wife Maria. Ms. Albright, with a feigned tone of concern, asked, "Captain Harris, we understand you've been through a difficult period recently. The loss of a loved one can be incredibly taxing, both emotionally and psychologically. Have you sought counseling? Are you currently taking any medication for stress or anxiety?" David's face tightened. "I grieve for my wife, yes, but my mind is sound. My judgment was clear." He looked away for a moment, his gaze drifting towards the window, where the vast expanse of the tarmac lay indifferent to the drama unfolding within. "And you hadn't prayed in months, correct?" Mr. Davies pressed, flipping through some notes, undoubtedly from David's earlier, more informal statement. "You've also admitted to having felt estranged from your faith since your wife's passing." David nodded. "That is true, but that doesn't change what I heard, or what I did." His answers, steadfast and unwavering in their core conviction, only seemed to solidify their diagnosis. To them, his prior lack of faith, coupled with his recent grief, provided a perfectly rational, albeit tragic, explanation for his current delusion. A man under extreme emotional duress, seeking solace, perhaps hallucinating, grasping for a connection he felt he had lost. It was a narrative they understood, a human tragedy, not a divine intervention. As the interrogation wore on, the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to grow louder, the air in the room thicker, heavier. The atmosphere became almost suffocatingly oppressive. I watched David, his initial composure slowly eroding under the relentless barrage of skeptical questions, the unspoken judgment in every glance. He was being stripped bare, his professional integrity, his sanity, his very character being systematically dismantled. Then, faint at first, but steadily growing in volume, the sounds of the terminal began to intrude. A murmur that rose to a disgruntled hum, then to frustrated voices. Through the thick glass of the conference room, I could see them now. The passengers of Flight 918, being escorted back into the main terminal. Their faces were a tableau of annoyance, anger, and mounting impatience. Some pointed towards our conference room, their gestures sharp, their mouths forming unspoken accusations. Officer Riley, who had been standing guard outside, entered briefly, his face flushed. "Mr. Thorne, sir," he whispered. "The passengers are getting restless. Many are demanding to know why the flight was delayed. Some are talking about missed connections, even lawsuits." Mr. Thorne nodded curtly. "Understood, Riley. Just keep them calm. Tell them we're experiencing unforeseen operational difficulties." The euphemism sounded hollow and inadequate, even to my ears. The news of the passengers' growing discontent hung heavy in the room, adding another layer of pressure, another charge to the indictment building against David. He was not just a pilot who broke protocol. He was now the cause of hundreds of inconvenienced, potentially litigious individuals. The weight of all those angry eyes, all those ruined schedules, pressed down on him. I could feel David withdrawing, not in defiance, but in a profound sense of isolation. How could he explain the unexplainable to them? To any of them? He had acted on a command that made no earthly sense, a command that defied every rule he had sworn to uphold. And now he was paying the price. The logic of the world was rendering its verdict. David Harris was unstable, a liability, a man who had broken the cardinal rules of his profession for a delusion. The evidence, from their perspective, was overwhelming. His own testimony, the bizarre nature of his claims, his recent emotional fragility, it all coalesced into a damning portrait of a man unsuited for the immense responsibilities of his role. I watched as Mr. Davies closed his notebook, the soft thud a final punctuation mark on the proceedings. "Captain Harris," he stated, his voice now devoid of any pretense of inquiry, simply a pronouncement, "given your statements and the egregious nature of your actions, your flight privileges are hereby suspended indefinitely, pending a full psychiatric evaluation and a comprehensive review by the FAA board. Your co-pilot will be assigned to take over Flight 918 whenever it is cleared for departure." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable, sealing David's fate. His career, the very identity he had forged over decades, had just been extinguished. He looked utterly broken, his shoulders slumping, the fight finally draining out of him. He wasn't crying, but his eyes were wide, staring at some distant point beyond the walls, beyond this room, beyond the airport. He looked like a man who had seen something truly incomprehensible and was now being punished for it. My heart ached for him. I had witnessed many forms of suffering in my years as a priest, but this was a unique agony. The agony of a man whose faith, once shattered, had been rekindled by an undeniable divine intervention, only to be dismissed as madness by a world that refused to acknowledge the sacred. He had obeyed a call he believed to be from God, and for that obedience he was being professionally crucified. In that sterile room, under the relentless hum of fluorescent lights, the chasm between human logic and divine truth yawned wide, threatening to swallow not just David's career, but his very soul. It was a dark, desolate place, a testament to how profoundly lost we can become when we refuse to entertain the possibility of the miraculous, when we privilege our own limited understanding over the boundless mystery of God's grace. I knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that David Harris desperately needed more than just a priest. He needed a reaffirmation, a sign, a tangible, undeniable echo of the voice that had spoken to him in the quiet of his cockpit. He needed a miracle to answer the world's judgment. And as I looked at his defeated form, I prayed, with a fervor born of deepest empathy, that such a miracle, if it truly was God's will, would not come too late. The sterile hum of the fluorescent lights in that conference room had felt like a judgment in itself, a cold, unyielding pronouncement against everything David held sacred. I watched the chasm between human logic and divine truth yawn wide, threatening to swallow not just David's career, but his very soul. It was a dark, desolate place, a testament to how profoundly lost we can become when we refuse to entertain the possibility of the miraculous, when we privilege our own limited understanding over the boundless mystery of God's grace. I knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that David Harris desperately needed more than just a priest. He needed a reaffirmation, a sign, a tangible, undeniable echo of the voice that had spoken to him in the quiet of his cockpit. He needed a miracle to answer the world's judgment. And as I looked at his defeated form, I prayed, with a fervor born of deepest empathy, that such a miracle, if it truly was God's will, would not come too late. The investigators, satisfied for the moment with their initial assessment of a pilot's mental instability, had taken a break. The room, which had been thick with the tension of accusation and the rigid adherence to procedure, now exhaled a quiet, exhausted sigh. It was my chance. I rose from my chair, my limbs stiff from the long hours of silent witnessing, and approached David. He sat hunched, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles were white, his gaze fixed on some invisible point on the polished table. His face, etched with exhaustion and a profound sense of failure, looked years older than it had just that morning. "David," I said, my voice soft, almost a whisper against the residual silence of the room. He flinched, as if startled awake from a waking nightmare. His eyes, clouded with a confusion that bordered on despair, finally met mine. "Come with me, my son. Let us find a quiet place." He did not argue, nor did he ask where we were going. It was as if all the fight, all the need to explain or justify, had been drained from him. He simply pushed himself up, his movements slow and heavy, the weight of the world seemingly pressing down upon his shoulders. As we walked through the hushed corridors of the administrative section, away from the bustling concourses and the watchful eyes of the airline staff, I felt a deep ache in my own heart. I had seen countless souls broken by grief, by loss, by the relentless pressures of life. But David's burden was unique. The sacred and the profane had collided within him, and he was left stranded in the wreckage, unsure if he was a prophet or a madman. The airport chapel, nestled discreetly between a duty-free shop and a bustling coffee stand, was a haven from the relentless pace of JFK. Its very existence was a testament to the enduring human need for sanctuary, a recognition that even amidst the roar of engines and the hurried footsteps of global travelers, there are moments when the soul cries out for stillness. As I pushed open the heavy oak door, the faint chime of a small bell above announced our arrival, and the clamor of the outside world receded, replaced by an enveloping quiet. The chapel was small, but every detail spoke of reverence and peace. The light filtered through a modest stained glass window depicting Our Lady of the Skies, a fitting patroness for this place, cast soft, jewel-toned hues across the worn pews. The air held the faint, comforting scent of beeswax and old wood, a fragrance that always reminded me of solace and prayer. A simple altar stood at the front, adorned with a white cloth and a crucifix. Above it a statue of the Blessed Mother, her gaze tender and serene, seemed to welcome all who entered, offering unspoken comfort. David stepped inside, and his shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, visibly slumped. It was as if the very atmosphere of the sacred space had begun to loosen the grip of his torment. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the familiar yet distant symbols of his childhood faith. When he reached the first pew, he did not hesitate. He collapsed onto it, not with grace, but with the utter surrender of a man whose strength had finally given out. His head dropped into his hands, and a low, ragged sound, a strangled gasp that was half sob, half exasperated sigh, escaped him. I knelt beside him, allowing him his moment of private desolation. I knew that at times like this, words were often inadequate, even intrusive. The deepest grief, the most profound confusion, demanded silence first. I simply rested a hand gently on his back, a silent offering of presence, a physical anchor in the storm of his inner world. The warmth of his coat beneath my palm, the subtle tremor that ran through his frame, spoke volumes of the raw, exposed nerves within. After a long moment, David lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and distant. "Father," he whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible. "Am I going crazy? Did I imagine it all?" The question hung in the quiet air, heavy with the weight of a lifetime's struggle. A man grappling with the terrifying possibility that his sanity had finally abandoned him. I looked at him, truly looked into the depths of his anguished soul, and I saw not madness, but profound suffering. "David," I responded, keeping my voice calm and steady, "what you experienced, what you heard, it was real to you. That is what we must begin with." I paused, searching for the right words, for the language of compassion that could bridge the chasm between his lived experience and the world's incredulity. The human heart, when it is open, can perceive things beyond the realm of what our ears can simply hear, or our eyes can simply see. Sometimes the Spirit speaks in ways that defy our neat categories. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound weariness. "But it makes no sense. I haven't heard him in years. Not since Maria." His voice trailed off, thick with emotion. The name of his beloved wife, a physical presence in the sacred space. "I was angry, Father. So angry. I locked him out. I blamed him for taking her. I stopped praying. I stopped going to Mass. I just existed. And now this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the entire impossible situation. The voice, the defied protocols, the ruined career. Why now? Why me? Why would God speak to a man who had turned his back on him? His confession poured out then, a torrent of raw, unvarnished grief and guilt. He spoke of the long, slow agony of Maria's illness, the helplessness he felt as he watched her fade. He described the gnawing emptiness that had consumed him since her passing, an emptiness that no amount of flying, no amount of precision or professional success could fill. His faith, once a vibrant tapestry woven into the fabric of their shared life, had unraveled thread by thread, until all that remained was a desolate void. He hadn't prayed in months, he reiterated, his voice heavy with self-condemnation. The last time he'd set foot in a church was for Maria's funeral, a bitter, resentful presence in a place that now felt alien to him. "I became a stranger to God, Father," he whispered, his eyes now closed, a tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "I became a stranger to myself. I flew, I ate, I slept, but there was no life in it, just routine. And then, this voice, it felt like her father, like Maria's peace, but it was him. I know it was him. And I disobeyed every rule, every instinct of my profession, for a voice I wasn't even sure was real, for a God I wasn't sure I still believed in. What kind of man does that?" I listened, my own heart aching with empathy. This was the crucible of faith, the point where human suffering collided with divine mystery. It was not my place to offer easy absolution, nor to dismiss his torment with platitudes. To tell him God works in mysterious ways would be to diminish the very real anguish of his doubt. Instead, I sought to validate his pain, to acknowledge the very human struggle of his soul. "David," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "God does not abandon us when we are angry. He does not stop loving us when we doubt him. In fact, it is often in our deepest moments of despair, in the wilderness of our unbelief, that he speaks most clearly, most unexpectedly." I paused, letting my words settle. "Your anger, your pain, your emptiness, these are not signs of your unworthiness. They are signs of your humanity, and they are, paradoxically, an open door. For when we are truly empty, truly at the end of ourselves, that is when we are most ready to receive something new, something we could never have conjured on our own." I offered no quick answers, no theological gymnastics to explain the inexplicable. Instead, I simply knelt beside him, a silent companion in his spiritual wasteland. The air in the chapel felt thick with the unspoken questions of millennia, the endless human quest for meaning in the face of suffering. I thought of Christ in Gethsemane, crying out to his Father, "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me." Even the Son of God, in his humanity, grappled with the terror of his path. David was doing no less. "Let us pray, David," I finally said, my voice soft. "Not for a sign, not for vindication, not for the world to understand. Let us pray simply for peace, for the peace that Maria now knows, for the peace that God longs to give you, even in the midst of your confusion." From my pocket I drew my worn rosary beads, smooth and cool against my fingertips, each bead a tangible connection to generations of prayer. David looked at them, his gaze lingering on the simple crucifix at the end, a flicker of something almost forgotten in his eyes. "Do you remember the rosary, David?" I asked, holding them out. He nodded slowly. "Maria, she prayed it every night. We used to pray it together sometimes, before everything." His voice was laced with a poignant nostalgia. "Then let us pray it again," I suggested. "It is a prayer not of petition but of meditation, a way to walk with Mary, who knew both profound joy and profound sorrow, and through her, to draw closer to her Son." I began, slowly, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen." David echoed the words, his voice raspy but present. We began with the Apostles' Creed, the ancient words of our faith, a foundational bedrock that could still offer solidity even when everything else felt like shifting sand. Then the Our Father, the Hail Marys, the Glory Bears, the familiar rhythm of the prayers, the tactile sensation of the beads slipping through our fingers, was a gentle balm, a quiet assertion of continuity in a world turned upside down. I chose the sorrowful mysteries for our meditation, knowing that David's soul was steeped in sorrow. The agony in the garden, the scourging at the pillar, the crowning with thorns, the carrying of the cross, the crucifixion. Each mystery, a contemplation of Christ's suffering, became a mirror for David's own. As we moved through the decades, I encouraged him to simply let the images and the words wash over him. "Think of Jesus in the garden, David," I murmured during the first mystery, overwhelmed with sorrow, to the point of death. His disciples asleep, leaving him alone in his deepest hour. Yet, he surrendered. "Not my will, but yours be done." David's breathing became more even. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, if only infinitesimally. He repeated the Hail Marys alongside me, his voice growing stronger, a hesitant thread weaving into the fabric of my own prayers. I watched him, observing the subtle shifts in his demeanor. It wasn't a miraculous transformation, not yet, but it was a softening, a shedding of the hardened shell of resentment and despair. With each Hail Mary, with each meditation on Christ's pain, we were not asking for solutions or answers. We were simply present. We were offering up his suffering, his confusion, his surrender, laying it all before God, not with demands, but with an open-handed vulnerability. We prayed for the soul of his wife, Maria, her memory a luminous thread connecting his past faith to this desperate present. We prayed for peace for her, and in doing so, we began to pray for a glimmer of peace for him. The chapel remained still, a sanctuary suspended between the earth and the heavens. The soft light shifted imperceptibly as the day outside progressed, a reminder of time passing even as we immersed ourselves in timeless prayer. I felt David's hand brush against mine as he reached for a bead, a small unconscious gesture of connection, of shared humanity in the face of the divine. This was a prayer not of petition, not of asking God to intervene in a specific way, but of pure, desperate faith in the face of utter desolation. It was a small act of trust in a God he was no longer sure could even hear him, a quiet surrender of his shattered will to something larger than himself. There was no thunderclap, no sudden revelation, only the gentle, rhythmic cadence of the prayers, a quiet seeking in the deepest darkness. David's eyes were still closed, his face still etched with sorrow, but there was a subtle softening, a faint, almost imperceptible opening of a heart that had been bricked over for so long. We continued, moving from the agony to the scourging, then to the crowning with thorns, each mystery a stepping stone deeper into shared contemplation, deeper into the quiet, desolate landscape of faith reclaimed, or perhaps simply remembered. The world outside, with its investigations and its certainties, faded to a distant hum. Here, in the quiet heart of the airport, only the prayers mattered, a fragile bridge cast across the abyss of doubt, a silent plea for a grace that could mend a broken soul. The quiet solitude of the chapel held us in its tender embrace, a fragile vessel against the mounting storm of the world outside. The rosary beads, cool and smooth against my fingertips, marked the steady passage of each Aves, each Pater, each Gloria. David's presence beside me was a grounding force, a shared vulnerability that transcended the simple act of prayer. We had moved through the agony in the garden, a silent meditation on Gethsemane, then to the scourging at the pillar, feeling, I hoped, some small fraction of the undeserved suffering. Now, as the last echoes of the fourth decade faded, we began the fifth and final sorrowful mystery, the crowning with thorns. "O most merciful Jesus," I murmured, my voice a soft counterpoint to the distant hum of the airport. "Who for us wast crowned with thorns? Have mercy on us." I glanced at David, his eyes still closed, his brow furrowed, not with worry, but with an intense, almost pained concentration. His breathing was deep even, a sign, I hoped, of some semblance of inner peace amidst the wreckage of his life. We were kneeling, and the ancient wood of the prie-dieu pressed against my knees, a familiar comfort. The stained glass window above the altar, depicting Our Lady of the Skies, shimmered with the filtered light of the late afternoon, casting ethereal hues of sapphire and ruby across the worn carpet. It was a haven, a sacred space where the ordinary rules of time and earthly consequence seemed to momentarily suspend their relentless grip. It was during the third Hail Mary of that final mystery, just as the words of the prayer were forming on my lips, that the first tremor came. It was subtle at first, a low, almost imperceptible vibration, like the distant resonance of a heavy truck passing far away on the tarmac. I paused, my mind instinctively trying to identify the source, to rationalize it. An unusually large cargo plane perhaps, or maintenance work on a distant runway. But then it deepened, growing from a hum into a low, guttural growl that resonated not just through the floor beneath us, but seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of my bones. David's eyes flickered open, wide and startled, his concentration shattered. The low growl swelled into a violent rumble, a sound that was raw and primal, utterly unlike the familiar symphony of an active airport. This was not the orderly roar of jet engines, nor the controlled shudder of ground equipment. This was the sound of the earth itself groaning, of something monumental tearing itself apart from deep within. The chapel began to shake, a slow, sickening oscillation that sent a chill through me. The small votive candles flickering on the altar trembled, their flames dancing erratically, threatening to extinguish. Then came the roar. It wasn't a singular sound but a cascade, a concussive wave that hit us with the force of a physical blow. It was deafening, a monstrous cacophony of crumbling stone, twisting metal, and a terrifying resonant boom that echoed deep in my chest. The stained glass window, that serene image of Our Lady, rattled violently in its ancient lead frame, each pane seeming to protest the sudden brutal assault. The very air in the chapel pressed in on us, thick with an unseen force. Before I could even voice a question, before David or I could fully register the shock, the air was rent by a piercing electronic shriek, alarms. Not one, but dozens, hundreds, erupting simultaneously from every corner of the vast terminal. A cacophony of urgent, panicked warnings that sliced through the residual roar. The quiet sanctity of our chapel was utterly shattered, replaced by the jarring, insistent clamor of an airport in crisis. The soft, meditative cadence of prayer was violently overwritten by the raw, unbridled cry of danger. Father? David's voice was a strained whisper, barely audible above the din, his face pale with a mixture of fear and a dawning, terrible comprehension. His gaze was fixed not on me but on the shaking window, his eyes wide with an unspoken question. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden chaos. Instinct took over. There was no longer any thought of quiet contemplation, no time for reasoned analysis. We had to know. We had to see. Pushing myself up from the prie-dieu, I reached for David's arm, pulling him gently but urgently to his feet. Come, I said, my voice hoarse. We must go. We stumbled out of the chapel, the wailing alarms intensifying with every step into the wider concourse. The transition from the hushed sanctuary to the pandemonium of the terminal was jarring, an assault on every sense. The fluorescent lights hummed with an almost aggressive intensity, reflecting off the polished floors where people now moved in disoriented surges, a bewildered, panicking flock caught in an unseen gale. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something acrid, metallic, something sharp that pricked at the back of my throat. Voices rose in a babble of fear and confusion, shouts, screams, the anxious cries of children. Uniformed airport staff, usually models of calm efficiency, now ran with desperate urgency, their walkie-talkies crackling with unintelligible commands. Security personnel, faces grim, attempted to direct the flow of terrified passengers, their authority momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the unknown threat. But amidst the chaotic movement, a strange, terrible stillness began to settle over pockets of people. Their heads were tilted, their bodies angled, all facing in one direction, like compasses drawn by an unseen magnet. They were looking out through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the concourse, the very windows that offered passengers their last glimpse of the world before embarking on their journeys or their first welcome upon arrival. I followed their gaze, my steps quickening, a dreadful premonition clenching my stomach. David was beside me, his hand gripping my arm with a strength born of pure adrenaline. We pushed our way through the throng, the cries and whispers of, "What happened? What was that?" forming a chilling litany. And then, we saw it. Through the immense expanse of glass, framed against the deepening twilight sky, was a scene that defied belief, a sight so utterly catastrophic, so fundamentally impossible, that my mind struggled to reconcile it with reality. Gate C-26. The gate. It was gone. Not damaged. Not a fire. Not an explosion as I might have morbidly anticipated from the roar. It was simply gone. Where the sturdy, familiar structure of the gate area had stood just moments before, where the ground crew would have been making final preparations, where the jet bridge would have been seamlessly connected to the aircraft, there was now a yawning, cavernous maw in the earth. A monstrous, jagged-edged sinkhole, impossibly vast, had opened up. It was a gaping wound in the very foundation of the airport, a raw, dark chasm that seemed to swallow light itself. The jet bridge, that umbilical cord connecting the terminal to the aircraft, lay twisted and mangled at the bottom of the abyss, its metallic spine contorted into an unrecognizable ruin. A huge section of the concrete apron, the very ground where Flight 918 had been parked, had simply vanished, swallowed whole by the ravenous earth. Electrical conduits, water pipes, and structural rebar dangled precariously from the ragged edges of the crater, severed and exposed like raw nerves. Water, a torrent of it, gushed from a fractured main deep within the sinkhole, cascading into the murky depths below, fueling a rising mist that curled eerily into the twilight. It was a vision of absolute, total destruction. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking, terrifying. The earth had simply opened up its maw and devoured the very spot where 300 souls would have been standing, waiting, boarding their flight to Rome. It was the precise location where Flight 918, fully fueled and ready for departure, would have been connected. Its massive wing tanks, brimming with thousands of gallons of volatile jet fuel, would have been directly over that point of collapse. The rupture of those tanks, the ensuing inferno, the unimaginable loss of life. It flashed through my mind with sickening clarity. A holy silence began to fall, creeping outwards from the witness points along the glass. The screaming alarms still blared. The voices still cried. But for those who stood transfixed before the enormous window, a profound, chilling stillness descended upon their hearts. The angry passengers, the skeptical airline executives, the federal investigators who had so clinically questioned David, they were all there, frozen in various states of disbelief, their eyes fixed on the abyss. Their arguments, their protocols, their certainties, all evaporated into the thin, acrid air. The impossible truth, heavy with the weight of revelation, descended upon them all. It was not a delusion. It was not a breakdown. It was not the breakdown of a man, but the breaking open of the earth. Had David Harris followed protocol, had he adhered to his schedule, his fully fueled Boeing 777 would have been connected to that gate, its wing tanks directly over the point of collapse. The rupture and ensuing fire would have been catastrophic, an unimaginable loss of life. I turned my gaze from the gaping maw to David. His face, moments ago etched with the quiet suffering of doubt, was now a mask of pure, unadulterated awe. There were no tears of vindication, no triumphant shouts of, "I told you so." Only the quiet, awestruck tears that now streamed down his cheeks, a silent deluge from a man who had just been answered in a way that defied every earthly explanation. His scandalous, career-ending act of insanity was now revealed for what it truly was, an act of divine preservation. The loop was closed. The voice he heard wasn't a delusion, it was a rescue. It was a command, a loving imperative from beyond the veil, whispered into the soul of a man who had felt abandoned by God, chosen specifically to avert a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. It was a miracle, raw and undeniable, laid bare for all to see. A testament not just to the power of God, but to the intricate hidden ways in which His grace moves through our broken world. The abyss where Gate C26 had been, now an open maw in the very fabric of the earth, swallowed not only concrete and steel, but also every last vestige of doubt. The stunned silence that had fallen over the concourse was not merely the absence of sound. It was the sacred hush of revelation, a collective intake of breath as the impossible truth solidified in every mind. The angry passengers, their voices still hoarse from shouts of frustration, stood transfixed, their complaints now ashes in their mouths. The skeptical airline executives, whose faces had been contorted by corporate fury just moments before, now wore expressions of stark, almost childlike terror. The federal investigators, their clinical detachment shattered, looked upon the scene with eyes widened, not by professional curiosity, but by a dawning, fearful wonder. In that profound silence, punctuated only by the distant, wailing sirens that now seemed ludicrously late, David stood utterly still. His tears had ceased, replaced by a gaze so distant, so profound, that it seemed to reach beyond the physical devastation before us, into the very heart of the mystery. There was no triumph in his eyes, no flicker of human vindication. There was only a quiet, consuming awe, the humility of a man who had touched the hem of eternity. He had been a vessel, unwittingly, imperfectly, and now the truth of that sacred intervention had unfolded before us all, undeniable and stark. The voice he had heard, the one that had threatened his career and his sanity, was no longer a personal burden. It was a public declaration of divine care. In the days that followed, the usual machinery of investigation simply failed to engage. How could one investigate the hand of God? There were no protocols for interviewing a miracle, no regulations to apply to a divine imperative. The airline, initially braced for a public relations nightmare and legal battles, found itself enveloped in an entirely different kind of storm. A spiritual awakening that swept through the terminal like a sudden cleansing wind. Instead of charges, there were testimonials. Instead of disciplinary hearings, there were impromptu prayer gatherings. David Harris was not fired. He was, in a quiet, almost reverent way, celebrated. His name, once synonymous with a pilot's reckless breakdown, became whispered with the awe reserved for saints and prophets. The change in the passengers was perhaps the most poignant testimony. Many of them, their faces still etched with the pallor of near death, sought me out in the quiet sanctuary of the airport chapel. They came in ones and twos, then in small groups, their stories tumbling out, each one a variation on a single theme, a life fundamentally reordered. A young woman who had scoffed at religion spoke of an undeniable pull toward the crucifix. An elderly gentleman, a lapsed Catholic, recounted feeling Maria's presence in the chapel, a warmth that had rekindled a faith he thought long dead. Their belief, once a casual nod to tradition, or perhaps even an outright rejection, had become the very bedrock of their existence. They spoke of the raw, visceral understanding that their lives had been spared by something far beyond human design, a direct intervention from a God they now knew with absolute certainty, saw and cared. I listened, absorbing their stories, offering comfort and guidance, but mostly simply bearing witness. Their newfound faith was not intellectual, it was experiential, born of dust and shattered concrete and the hollow echo of a narrowly averted catastrophe. It was a messy, human faith, full of questions and wonder, but undeniably real. They understood, in a way that sermons rarely convey, that God's love is not always confined to the pages of Scripture or the rituals of the Mass. Sometimes it manifests in the most improbable ways, through the most unlikely instruments, shattering our preconceptions and forcing us to confront the extraordinary in the mundane. And David, he was transformed. The raw edges of his grief, which had once defined him, were softened by an abiding peace. He flew again, eventually, but not as the hollowed-out professional he had been. His movements were still precise, his checks still meticulous, but there was a new lightness in his step, a quiet luminosity in his eyes. He often spoke to me in the chapel not of the miracle itself, which he still struggled to fully articulate, but of the peace that had settled within him, the renewed sense of purpose. He spoke of Maria not with the crushing weight of loss, but with the gentle warmth of enduring love, now understanding that her spirit, too, had played a part in leading him back to God's embrace. He flew with the silent companionship of a co-pilot he knew was always beside him, a divine presence that had filled the empty cockpit of his soul. His hands on the yoke were steady, but his heart now beat to a rhythm of gratitude and unwavering faith. Sometimes, after the last flight of the night has departed and the terminal grows quiet, I walk to the chapel window. I look out at gate C26, now meticulously repaired, the concrete pristine, the jet bridge gleaming under the soft airport lights. It is a silent monument, not to an engineering feat or a logistical triumph, but to a mystery. It stands as a constant, gentle reminder that God does not always thunder from a mountaintop, parting seas or speaking in burning bushes. Sometimes his love is a gentle whisper in a quiet cockpit, a loving command that makes no earthly sense, a moment of profound illogic that overturns all human reason. It is a miracle designed not only to save our lives from temporal harm, but to save our souls from the deeper peril of unbelief, guiding us back to the truth that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly abandoned. That gentle voice, once so terrifying in its impossibility, became the sound of salvation echoing through the concourse of eternity. That gentle voice, once so terrifying in its impossibility, became the sound of salvation echoing through the concourse of eternity. And in the immediate aftermath, those echoes reverberated not just in our ears, but in the very core of our being. The initial chaos and panic that had gripped the terminal swiftly gave way to a profound, almost reverent hush. The alarms, once shrill and insistent, fell silent, leaving behind a vacuum filled only by the whisper of disbelieving murmurs. The frantic voices that had accused and condemned David Harris were replaced by a collective, palpable intake of breath. In that moment, all the world's rules, its meticulous protocols, its clinical logic, crumbled like the concrete apron that had just vanished. There was no investigation into Captain David Harris. How could there be? What charge could be leveled against a man who, by an act of holy disobedience, a sacred, illogical leap of faith, had averted a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions? The very air hummed with an unspoken, undeniable truth. His superiors, once stern and unyielding, their faces etched with the cold certainty of corporate liability, now regarded him with a mixture of profound relief and bewildered respect, as if they had witnessed the veil between worlds thinned to transparency. He was not fired, he was revered, not with grand accolades or public pronouncements, but with a quiet, almost fearful deference that settled around him like a sacred mantle. His co-pilot, who just hours prior had been caught between professional duty and disbelief, now looked at David as if he had seen a true prophet, a vessel for a power beyond their imagining. Even the federal investigators, men of sharp minds and sharper regulations, found themselves grappling with an event that defied every chapter in their manual. Their reports, I imagine, must have been unusually brief, or perhaps filled with a new kind of bewildered wonder that they dared not articulate, relegated to the dusty archives of the inexplicable. But it wasn't just David whose life was irrevocably altered. In the days and weeks that followed, a quiet pilgrimage began. Many of the passengers from Flight 918 sought me out in the solace of the chapel, or even just in the bustling concourse, drawn by a need to understand, to share, to bear witness to the impossible made manifest. Their lives, once comfortably mundane, were now sharply divided into the time before the miracle and the time after. I recall an elderly woman, her hands gnarled with age and arthritic pain, telling me how she had scoffed at David's initial breakdown, convinced he was a danger to them all. Now her eyes shone with an almost youthful light as she spoke of a newfound gratitude that felt like a fresh spring bubbling up in her weary soul. "I always thought faith was for Sunday mornings, Father," she confessed, her voice thin but clear. "A nice tradition, a comforting habit. But now it feels like the very air I breathe, the beat of my own heart." A young couple planning their honeymoon in Rome spoke of postponing their trip, not out of fear, but out of a profound need to reevaluate their priorities, their dreams, their very understanding of existence. Their initial anger, once a palpable force that had fueled their demands for compensation and explanation, had melted into tears of humbling wonder. "We were so angry, Father," the young woman admitted, "so focused on our delayed plans, our lost luggage. We were blind. We were given a second chance at everything, and all we could see was an inconvenience." For so many, faith, once a casual or forgotten thing, a dusty relic in the attic of their lives, was now the very bedrock of their existence, solid and unyielding, built on the shifting sands of an impossible rescue. They saw the crater, they heard the explanation, and the logic of God, so often obscured by the noise of the world, pierced through with blinding clarity, illuminating the landscape of their souls. And David, he eventually flew again. The initial reports of his mental instability were quietly, almost apologetically recategorized. He underwent no counseling for delusion, no psychiatric evaluation beyond the routine. How could one counsel against a truth so starkly manifest? He continued to command the skies, but he was a changed man, no longer the hollowed-out shell running on procedure alone, his heart a locked room. The cold, technical precision remained, for that was the essence of his skill, but it was now imbued with a gentle grace, a quiet reverence for the fragile lives entrusted to his care. He spoke less of the voice in the cockpit to others, understanding that some mysteries are too sacred for casual articulation, too personal for public dissection. But I saw it in his eyes, in the way he moved, in the profound peace that now seemed to radiate from him, a beacon in the often turbulent skies. He flew with a co-pilot, yes, but he also flew with a deeper, ever-present awareness of another. A divine co-pilot he knew was always with him, guiding his hand, whispering truths beyond the reach of human instruments. His grief for Maria, though still a tender ache, a shadow that would forever linger, was no longer a consuming darkness. It was transformed, integrated into a broader understanding of life's profound interconnectedness, a cosmic design where even loss could open the door to deeper faith, where the suffering of the cross could lead to the glory of resurrection. He had not abandoned God. God had simply waited, in the quietest possible way, for David to open the bricked-up room of his heart once more, to remember the sacred intimacy they had once shared. For my part, I often stand by the window of the chapel, especially in the late afternoon when the setting sun bathes the tarmac in a golden glow, and look out at Gate C-26. It stands, meticulously repaired, the concrete pristine, the jet bridge gleaming under the soft airport lights. It is, as I reflected before, a silent monument, not to an engineering feat or a logistical triumph, but to a profound and enduring mystery. It stands as a constant, gentle reminder that God does not always thunder from a mountaintop, parting seas or speaking in burning bushes. Sometimes his love is a gentle whisper in a quiet cockpit, a loving command that makes no earthly sense, a moment of profound illogic that overturns all human reason. It is a miracle designed not only to save our lives from temporal harm, but to save our souls from the deeper peril of unbelief, guiding us back to the truth that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly abandoned. That gentle voice, once so terrifying in its impossibility, became the sound of salvation echoing through the concourse of eternity, a melody that continues to resonate within me and within all who bore witness to that extraordinary day, forever changing how we listen for the voice of God.